We are in this series called Engage. If you've been here with us the last few weeks, this is the fourth week out of this series. If you've missed any of the last 3 weeks, I would really encourage you to check out our podcast or get on our website and listen to the first 3 weeks. Because what this series is talking about is, okay, I'm curious, I want to become a Christian or I want to become a member of the church. Now what? What do I do? And what we kind of went off here are, there's 5 things, and this isn't this exhaustive list of what you should be doing, but if you want to be a follower of Jesus and belong to his church, there are 5 things you need to be doing to be kind of fully engaged with the church. And so we've covered the first 3 of these. Just a quick recap, we talked about worshiping, how we need to make worship a regular habit, a regular a part of our lives, and to worship God, we need to learn more about him, so we do that through daily reading of Scripture and daily prayer. We talked in week 2 about sharing your story. Ken preached that week and talked about our stories are valuable because they're unique. And my story may not relate to you, but your story might relate to somebody else. You know, and we can all reach other people and different people because of our unique stories. And that all of us have the ability to preach the word, whether you've been to Bible college or not. And then last week we talked about how to connect, how to live in community. We said that when God created everything and he said how good it was, there was one thing that stuck out that he said wasn't good, and that was that man shouldn't be alone. So this week we're going to go ahead and step into number 4 on this list. And before we do this, I want to ask you a question, and I want you just to kind of think about this. If you're taking notes, you can write down an answer. Otherwise, you can think of an answer here. But the question I want to ask you is this: what motivates you to do what you do? Okay, now the question isn't what do you like to do, okay, but what motivates you to do what you like to do, or what motivates you to do what you do. Okay, now I'll let that hang there for a second. You can think about that. That may be kind of a deep question a little bit here, kind of that what's your why question. Why do you do what you do? But to answer this question, to kind of find out why we do what we do, there are dozens and dozens of these new tests and assessments out there that kind of let you know more about yourself. And over the last few years, I've got to experience a lot of these. Have kind of been pushed on us depending on what we were involved with. When I was teaching, we did one that was strictly based on motivation. It was called Motive Matters. It was this color-coded thing, and whatever color you got would determine why you did what you did. And then we did one called a Myers-Briggs assessment that gives you this breakdown of how highly relational you are, how much you think, how much attention to detail you give, et cetera, et cetera. Then I got exposed to one called the DISC. It's an acronym. Those 4 letters are an acronym, and you answer these questions, and you get a score based on each letter. And if you're a high D, that means you're kind of more of a dominant personality. It's like, you know, you're the rah-rah type of leader, the charge the hill type of leader. If you're a high I, you're extremely relational. You'll talk to a tree if you need to. I mean, you're constantly talking. If you're a high S, you're steady, you know, you're slower to do things because you want to think things through. A high C, it's attention to detail, on and on it goes. But all these, you read them. There's a book out called the Birth Order book that says you do things based on where you were born in your family. So if you're a firstborn, you're a little bit more independent. You're a little bit more cautious. You think things through. You're not as much of a risk taker, so to speak. So an interesting nugget on this too. If you're a firstborn, you probably have a higher stress level. You know why? Because you were the guinea pig. Your parents had to see if they could make a child survive. And so now you naturally have more stress in your life. I am a firstborn. I have a lot of stress in my life. That really hit home. I wanted to call my mom and my dad and say, thanks. I'm blaming this on you now. But all these, you read these, and what they are is they're not necessarily just labels you have to wear, but they allow you to kind of peer into yourself a little bit to answer that question, what motivates me to do what I do? There's a book that came out several years ago. Some of you may be familiar with it, called The 5 Love Languages, written by a guy named Gary Chapman. A lot of you, again, probably have read this or probably are familiar with this. What this does is it's an interesting take because he breaks down, as the title says, 5 different ways that we receive love. These aren't how we give love, it's how we receive love. The 5 love languages are quality time, words of affirmation, acts of service, physical touch, and receiving gifts. And it's receiving gifts, not giving gifts, because again, it's how you receive love. And so I'm curious, if I said those 5, if you've done this, you might know what yours is, but if you haven't, what you think yours might be. Again, quality time, physical touch, receiving gifts, words of affirmation, and acts of service. For example, for me, my top love language is words of affirmation. And it's not that I have to have my ego inflated, but hearing that I've done something well or that I'm appreciated lets me know I'm doing the job that is expected of me. I'm following through on that. And my wife's number 1 is quality time. I'm just going to say that one. I'm pretty sure that's what hers is, because she wants to be together all the time, no matter what we're doing. And actually, when I took this quiz again this week, just to kind of brush back up on it, quality time was my number 2. And what that tells us is we don't have to be doing anything important as long as we're together. I mean, we could be in the same room on our phones, reading books, watching TV, but we're in the room together. If you went with what Jeff and Gretchen taught a few months back on the Love and Respect class, he talks about shoulder-to-shoulder time. That's kind of what that is. But you think through those, and we think about how we receive love. And the irony for me when I look at these, and when I saw my results, ranked 1 through 5, is how I receive love and how I give love are opposite. Because my number 1 on how I receive love is words of affirmation, but that's probably of the 5 the one I'm the worst at actually doing. And at the bottom of mine, in terms of how I need to receive love, was giving gifts and acts of service. But those are probably the 2 that I would rather do than the others. It's just kind of funny how that plays out, kind of funny how that works out. And I thought about these, and I'm curious how many of you would say that your primary love language, you've not taken this, but the way you feel appreciated and loved by somebody else is through physical touch. How many of you would say that? Okay, and again, this is not like intimate touch. This is like, being hugged or touched on the shoulder or touched on the, just physical touch, okay? Several of you, okay? Ken, I know that now. I'm going to hug you every time I see you. If you see me hugging Fraunfelter, it's because he needs love. How many of you would say your primary love language is quality time? Okay, you just need to be with that person. Okay, how many of you would say it's words of affirmation? Okay, good. I'm not the only arrogant one here. Good. How many of you would say it is receiving gifts? Okay, not to say you have to have gifts, but somebody gives you something, and that just means a lot to you. Okay, and then how many of you would say yours is acts of service? Somebody doing something for you is your primary love language. Now think about these, and I think about how I flip this around and how I offer these. And all of these have some sort of price tag with them, okay? You think about it, some of these don't require much effort. Words of affirmation doesn't require that much effort. John, I really appreciate your Hawaiian shirts. Didn't take much effort, did it? Didn't have to be honest. I just said it to him. I was joking there. Nobody laughed. Nobody laughed. Apparently I snuck that in too much. But words of affirmation doesn't take much effort, okay? You think about giving gifts. Man, Amazon has made this where it requires little effort at all. Think about my niece just had her birthday this past week. We got on Amazon for a few minutes, found her a present, boom, sent it right to their house. Didn't have to wrap it or anything. Of course, my family returns the favor at Christmas, and they send all my kids stuff here, and we get to wrap all their presents for them. But giving gifts has gotten simple, but it requires a little bit of time, a little bit of money. Physical touch requires hardly any effort. Again, you walk by somebody, you pat them on the shoulder, shake their hand, give them a quick hug. It requires very little effort. It requires a little bit of thoughtfulness, okay? And then quality time, obviously just, you have to have time. An hour for somebody for lunch or just spending time with somebody. But you think about acts of service, it's kind of the oddball here because it requires all the above. Acts of service requires thoughtfulness. It requires your resources, whether that's your time, your energy, your money, your abilities. And it requires your intentionality. It requires all the above. It requires probably a little more sacrifice than all the rest of these. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit today is service. And then that's obviously where we're getting at with the fourth part of this series on Engage is how to serve others. Because we think about serving, and a lot of us, probably, if we were to say on a scale of 1 to 10, how much we really enjoy serving, probably a lot of us, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, we're above a 5. Okay, maybe some of you are a 10, like you have to be serving nonstop. But a lot of us probably enjoy serving to some degree, at least. Yet all of us, by our nature, are selfish. Okay, a lot of us like to serve in a certain way at a certain time for a certain purpose. Service, though, is selfless. Service is beyond just what I think and what I want. Service is seeing a need and meeting a need kind of regardless. See, again, I think that we live in a world that is wanting. And what I mean is society today is pushing a lot of us, a lot of Christians even, into this desire of what can I get that I want? How can I build a world around me that's exactly what I'm looking for that I want? And that makes it difficult. Because when we start doing that, we start looking at ourselves. We look inwardly constantly. And here's the thing, it's very hard to live a fulfilled life when all you're doing is looking inward. All you're doing is looking at me. In fact, I think you could kind of look at it this way. A life that's lived for just me is wasted. I heard this week that you could go to heaven with a saved soul but a wasted life. In other words, you've got all these gifts that God gave you that you never truly used, that you never truly put to work for Him and for His kingdom and for other people. And sadly, that happens far too often. You can go to heaven with a saved soul and a wasted life. See, here's the thing, folks. I think that when it comes to us and breaking from that selfish mold, that, let's be honest, we all have to some degree. Maybe we wouldn't label ourselves as a selfish person, but there's some selfish tendencies in us. Nothing breaks that selfish tendency more than serving others. And if you want to look in the Bible, there is absolutely no greater example of service than what Jesus showed us right before He went to the cross. A lot of you are going to know this passage very well. And if you've got a Bible and you want to turn there, it's in John 13. We're going to camp out there for a little bit. But as you're turning there, I want to set this up because this is the last night of Jesus' life. This is a Thursday night of Easter week. He's going to the cross the next day. In just a matter of an hour or two from this moment, He's going to be arrested in the garden. He's already been betrayed, okay? And in the midst of all of this almost ridiculous event unfolds. See, to kind of set this up, they are in the middle of what we now know as the Last Supper. Okay, some of you, maybe you've got this painting on your wall, or maybe your grandparents had this painting on their wall, because I think all of our grandparents had this painting on their wall at some point, that Last Supper painting. And while they are there, Jesus has already basically given them what we use for communion meditation often. Hey, my blood is about to be poured out for you, so take it. My body is about to be broken for you, so take it. This is a very, very heavy and somber night and event and moment. And right in the middle of all of this, while they're having the meal, this argument breaks out. And we see this little context here in Luke chapter 22. Verse 24, it says, a dispute also arose among them, that's the disciples, as to which of them was to be considered the greatest. Okay? Now think about this. Jesus is literally pouring Himself out. He's about to go to the cross, and this is what they want to argue about. Which of us is the greatest? You see, they're sitting around a table, and the way it worked in their culture was the host was the most important person. They sat at the middle of the table. That's where Jesus is sitting. He's no doubt hosting this meal. But then who sat immediately to His left and to His right? Those were the next two most important people in the room. And then it just trickled on down. So you kind of arrange yourself in that order. Okay? And that's what's taking place here. They're arguing over who should be sitting immediately next to Jesus, and then in those next two seats, and so on and so forth. And they're having this argument, and we can put the Gospels together because the Gospels all tell about this night, but then John adds this detail in chapter 13 that the others don't. And right in the middle of their argument, right in the middle of their bickering, Jesus does something that just still to me to this day doesn't fully make sense. Because here's what we read in John chapter 13. Verse 2, it says, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now, push pause here for a second, because I want to kind of address two things on this. First, that verse in Luke, we read about that. That's not an uncommon thing for the disciples. In fact, that's the third time we read about the disciples arguing over who's the greatest and the most important. In fact, in one of the instances, one of their moms came to Jesus and said, hey, I think my son should be sitting at your right and left-hand side. Really getting involved there, right? But now they're having this argument. They're having this go on. And we look at them and we point fingers and go, man, I can't believe they would do this. And it makes me kind of wonder, man, do we sometimes get guilty of the same thing? Do we in the church, I mean, let's be honest, do we sometimes get guilty of the exact same thing? Do we sometimes get guilty of trying to angle and put ourselves in places of position or of power and influence? Do we do that? I mean, I've been guilty of it. I've been guilty of it. I've been guilty of being a member of a church and trying to get and say, you know what, I really need to be heard. I really need to be the one you're listening to. And sometimes have to step back and remember that I'm just a follower. I'm simply just a servant. But you look at this especially. This verse in verse 2. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas. Jesus is about to do this, and Judas is sitting right there. And he's already betrayed Jesus, and Jesus knows it. And Jesus is about to do the most absurd thing he could possibly do to somebody who has already betrayed him. When somebody's betrayed you, what do? How quick do you cut them out of your life? Even if you're offering forgiveness to them, man, you're going to really keep an eye on them to make sure it doesn't happen again, right? And now Jesus is about to do one of the most ridiculous forms of service you could possibly do to someone. Verse 3 said, Jesus knew the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. I think about that verse right there too, because I think, man, if that was me, okay, that God had given me all the power in the world to do whatever needed to be done, and I was about to go to heaven anyway, and the person who betrayed me was in the room, I'm like, this could be fun. Payback time. That's what crossed my mind anyway. Maybe it crosses yours. But Jesus got it from the meal. He took off his outer clothing. He wrapped a towel around his waist. What is he doing? He is putting on the posture of a slave. Not just a servant, a slave. Think about this. Think about this for one moment here. And I want to ask you a question that I want you to think about. What is one thing that somebody might ask you to do for someone else or for them that you would look at that and go, man, that is just so far beneath me. I would never, ever do that. Just think about that for a second. What's the one thing that's so far underneath you, that's so far below your dignity, so far below what you think is your personal integrity? Because verse 5 says that after he did that, Jesus poured water into a basin and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, we do this today sometimes, okay? We do a foot washing service as a sign of humble servitude. But I want to set some context for you to kind of understand exactly what this job entailed. This isn't 21st century America where the roads were nice and paved. The roads were dirt. People walked everywhere they went, either barefoot or in sandals. They weren't wearing shoes that were closed-toed with nice, cozy soles on them. They walked, their feet were cracked and nasty. I don't like feet, period, today. Okay? I don't like clean feet. I don't like my kids' feet. Okay? My wife will tell you that. Like, get those off me. Put them on someone else. These feet were nasty, dirty, cracked, broken open, chapped, whatever you want to go on and on. And let's not even talk about toenail hygiene, because I'm sure they didn't have a whole lot of that back then. But think about this a step further. Let's make this even more of a pretty picture. You think about now when when you go to the restroom to relieve yourself, it goes into this nice toilet that you flush and it goes away. They didn't have those back then. They essentially went in a bucket. And guess where the bucket got dumped? Out on the roads. So I'm just going to leave that there. They kind of give you a perspective of where their feet have been. And now he comes in here and they've got the water and they wash the feet. You realize some people wouldn't even require their slaves to wash feet because it was so nasty and disgusting. Some people, they looked at their slaves and go, you know what, that's below even you. And the slave was the lowest person on a very rigid social ladder. You had a place, and it was almost impossible to get out of your rung on that social ladder. And so for Jesus was the Lord of all. He still is. To put on something below even a slave and wash the feet of his disciples. Again, I read this and I just shake my head and go, forget all the miracles. Did this story really happen? Because it's so hard to picture in our context today. Because all of us, let's be honest, all of us may be willing to serve, but we have our limits on just how far we'll go. And here's Jesus blowing right past all those limits. Here's Jesus doing something unthinkable and unimaginable. And he does it, and I picture him doing this and the disciples still arguing and still bickering about something that doesn't even matter. And I'm wondering how long it took them to finally stop and realize what was going on. Because here's something you need to understand about the disciples. They still had no idea what was about to happen. They still had no idea who Jesus really was. Go back to that verse in Luke. The reason they're arguing for seats around the table is they think Jesus is about to stroll into Jerusalem on the white horse and overthrow the Romans and overthrow the establishment and become the king. And they want a seat at his cabinet. You got Peter like, dude, I'm going to be vice president, okay? Okay, John's like, I'm secretary of whatever, secretary of labor. I'm Secretary of State. They're fighting for spots because that's what they think is about to happen. Verse 12, it says that when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and he returned to his place. And he asked them, do you understand what I've done for you? Now here's the spoiler alert, they didn't. They had no clue what he had just done. In fact, Peter, in the midst of that, goes, no, Lord, I should be washing your feet. Of course, he wasn't ready to jump down and do it. But Jesus kind of wraps this up and he explains this. And here's why I think he did this. Because there's three things in it that he did that we still today, 2,000 years later, need to understand. Three things that come out of this, three lessons that come out of this, and he tells us these. This isn't like a three-point sermon kind of thing. No, he actually is saying this in verses 15 through 17. He says, I have set an example for you, that you should do as I have done for you. Truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master. Now you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. So what are our lessons? Well, he set an example for us. Serve like I've served. What's our second example? No servant's greater than his master. Guess who our master is? Jesus. We're servants. Why can't we be greater than our master? Because everything we are and have comes from him. So it's his anyway. And then finally, you're going to be blessed if you do this. Be blessed if you serve. Go back to the question I asked earlier. What motivates you to do what you do? Some of you serve here at the church. Some of you serve in the community. Some of you serve in schools. You serve in different avenues and angles. And the question still stands, what motivates you to do what you do? See, here's the thing. I think for me, I always try to say, well, I'm serving because Jesus served and he told me to. But is that really a good enough reason? See, I've decided for me, I want to serve because I want to become like Jesus. Not just because he told me to. I want to obey, but I want to become more like him. And I can't do that if I'm not willing to get my knees dirty sometimes. Not my hands dirty, get my knees dirty. I'm willing to get down in front of somebody else to serve them. And when it comes to the church, obviously, I think to get fully engaged with the church, we need to move beyond just serving outside of ourselves. We need to serve here. It's a humility thing. It's a humble thing. It's a servant thing. See, Jesus wasn't one of these leaders who just kind of went with the motto of do as I say, not as I do. No, he did it. He served us all the way to the cross. In fact, one of his personal mission statements was about service. You've heard me say this many times, that after he comes back from the dead, he tells the disciples, as the Father sent me, I am sending you. One of the ways that Jesus came was to serve. Mark chapter 10, he tells us this, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. You know what this was in response to? This was in response to another part of the disciples arguing over who was greatest. Jesus' response, anytime people talked about being the greatest, his response was to serve. His response was a call to serve. So this is what today is. It's a call to serve. It's a call to serve specifically here in the church. Because let's just be honest, we need servants. We need a community of servants. See, the church can only grow so much without service. But with service, man, the kingdom's ripe. The kingdom's ripe. At the Bible college that I went to, they've got this kind of motto or kind of a recruiting slogan that's called "Just One." Just one. That's their mantra they go out with. Just one. In other words, we're looking for just one servant, and then you go find one servant, and that person go find one servant. Just one. You're just one. But we're all just one, and we bring all those ones together, we can change the world. And that's what they pride themselves on at the school, is raising up not just pastors, but servant leaders. Servants. So that's the call to serve the church. And kind of like last week we talked, I know there's easy excuses that are built into our lives. Easy excuses that want to keep us from serving. And kind of like last week, we're going to kind of blow those out of the water for you a little bit. So if you've been clinging to one of these excuses and you feel personally attacked here, then that's kind of the point, so just bear with us. But here's probably the number one excuse we hear a lot from people. It's this one. I'm unqualified. Well, here's a spoiler alert. We all are. I am. Okay, we're all unqualified. Some people go, Kurt, I haven't even been a Christian very long. I'm not even a Christian yet. I don't care. Come on board. We've had people who've actually come to Jesus after they started serving here. Why? Because through serving, they actually are around people who help them come to Jesus. Or somebody goes, you don't understand what I've been through. I've got a really dirty, nasty, checkered past. I've done some bad things. And then I'm unqualified. Let me tell you something. If you think your past, if you think your situation, if you think whatever flaws you might have disqualifies you from being used by God, you haven't read the Bible very much. Because it's like literally every page is somebody who is horribly unqualified to do what God's calling them to do. And here's just a short list for you. Abraham was too old. Okay, Jacob was insecure. Leah was unattractive. Joseph was abused and neglected. Moses God called him to be a preacher and he couldn't talk. Seems like a problem, right? He stuttered. He had anger issues. Jeremiah was depressed. Rahab was immoral. Go to the New Testament. It doesn't stop in the Old Testament. All the apostles they were fishermen. They were just average, ordinary people. They weren't scholars. Peter was a hothead. Thomas had doubting issues. Martha had too much anxiety. How about Paul? He literally killed Christians. And what does God call him to do? Go lead Christians. Now, you read Acts, and there were some Christians that were very nervous to follow Paul those first few days. And I cannot say that I blame them. And maybe the greatest example of all is David. This was a man that God later called the man after God's own heart. David committed a very famous act of adultery, and then to cover it up, he killed the husband of the woman he slept with, or had him killed. And we forget too, David was a horrible parent. David's sons were trying to kill each other. I'm not a perfect parent, but I haven't got to that point with my kids yet, And God used them. See, here's the thing. Go back to what we talked about a couple weeks ago with your story. Whatever is in your past is part of who you are today. It's shaped you. It doesn't necessarily define you, but it has shaped you. And we all have a uniqueness about us, and we're all gifted in different ways. And God will use those gifts. God will use them in ways that only He can. I'm curious how many of you have ever taken a spiritual gifts assessment, where you've done this quiz and it tells you this is where God has gifted you. And it seems funny to take a test that some computer will tell you where God has gifted you, but it answers questions based on your preferences. Would you rather this or that? On a scale of 1 to 5, would you rather do this at a 5 or a 1? And it's going to give you your answers. You can find lists of spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 or Romans 12. You can find them in Ephesians 4. There's several spots in the New Testament where these are listed. But if you've not taken what I would encourage you, get online and find one. You just Google spiritual gifts test or spiritual gifts assessment. You're going to find several opportunities to take it. But you are never, let me say this, you are never ever unqualified to serve the church, to serve God. Here's the second excuse, and this is the one that I know we're all going to come up with. I'm too busy. I blew this one out of the water last week. I'm not going to rehash it. If you want to go listen to last week, listen to last week. But I'm going to say this about it. Some of us are too busy to come serve the church, maybe on a Sunday or some other time, because we have something else we would rather do. Heard this analogy and I liked it. If I was going to move, let's say that next week I'm going to move, and I call you and I say, hey, I need some help moving. You're probably like, man, I'd love to. But I've got to work, I've got some stuff around the house I really need to get done. So, I'll see if I can make it, man. I'll try. Let's be honest. How many, I'm going to answer you that way. How many else would be honest and say I would answer that way too? Because that's probably going to be my answer if you called me. I'll be there if I can. Let's say I called you next week and I'm like, hey, I got 2 extra tickets to the Ducks game or the Beavers game. You want to go with me? Yeah, I got nothing to do, man. I'm free. I'll be there. See, here's the thing. It's easy for us to find time to do something that's important to us. I'm just going to leave it at that. If you're too busy to serve at the church, we need to step back and check our priorities. Here's the third excuse that we hear a lot is that, well, maybe the church doesn't need me. There seems to be a lot of people serving. That's never, ever, 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 ever going to be the truth. The church could have every single person here serving, and we're still going to be looking for more. Why? Because we can only do so much. As a staff, we can only do so much. The elders can only do so much. Our current people serving, our current leaders serving, our current everybody else serving can only do so much. And let me say this too. I mentioned earlier, words of affirmation is not something I'm good at expressing. But if you serve here, whether it's on a Sunday and you're visible or it's during the week and it's not visible, thank you. None of it goes unnoticed. We had guys like Jack McCormick who would be here all during the week almost every day, doing stuff that nobody else would even notice unless it wasn't done all the time. It gets noticed. We have people here still. At the risk of leaving people out, I'm not going to start naming names. But thank you. Those of you who serve in our kids, with our youth, here on Sundays on stage, back there in that booth, out front in the coffee bar, to the people who take care of our grounds, the people who come in and take care of our finances, all of it, thank you. Because we wouldn't be where we are without you. Okay, it's that simple. Church that I was at in Arizona, one of the largest churches in the country, they'll have almost 30,000 people per weekend show up for church. They have, I'm not making this up, about 15,000 people volunteer on a weekly basis. That blows me away. And guess what? They still need more. They still need more. There's always going to be places here for you. In fact, right now, I'm going to just throw a few of these up on the screen. Here's some places right now we could use help. If you want to serve, here's some places right now. Our kids' ministry needs help. Man, Kathy does an amazing job with our kids. Amazing job. But we need help. We need more people in there. And maybe you're called to, you're like, man, I'm great with babies and toddlers, and you want to get terrorized by my 15-month-old son. He's right over there right now destroying that room. So who would love to go help take care of that little angel? You're like, man, I love preschoolers. Well, guess what? You can take my middle one. You can take my 4-year-old, Amelie. Okay? She's fun. She's easy. Maybe you're like, I'm better with older kids, like, kind of K through 5. Well, guess what? You can have my second grader who will wear you out with questions. I'm really making this something you want to do, right? That's kids, though, right? That's kids. Maybe for you, it's like, well, kids isn't my thing, but man, I'm a highly relational person. I love meeting people. We could use you on our First Impressions team, our greeters out front here on Sunday mornings, over in our coffee bar. Serving communion, or taking offering, those types of things. First impressions are the ones who help our guests feel wanted and welcomed. You could help there. You could help on our production team back in the booth with Jim. You could help. We're creating a new team called our stage hosting team. That's going to be a group of people who comes up and does announcements, does communion meditation, does offering. Somebody who's a face, who's visible, who's going to greet you and welcome you here. If you're interested in that, man, let us know. Our Lord's Storehouse always needs more hands. On Tuesdays to go pick up our food and bring it and stock it. On Wednesdays to work the night when people come. If you're interested in that, that's why we put this connection card in your bulletin. Last week I asked if you're interested in a group to fill that out. If you're interested in serving specifically in those areas, let us know. There's other areas too, and if you're gifted in a certain area, write it down. Write it down. Because we will love to have you helping serve here at the church. There's never going to be a spot where we don't need you. We don't need the help. Here's the fourth example, and this is one that's probably a little touchy to talk about sometimes. Probably one we don't want to admit sometimes. But sometimes we have this excuse, let's be honest, that works beneath me. I'm not going to do that. Again, we said this earlier. We're all willing to serve, but we all have our limits too. Let's be honest. Some of us feel we have earned a certain thing. We deserve a certain thing. And sometimes we say no to certain work because, again, that's beneath me. And again, I'll be honest. I've been there and I've kind of said these same things in my past. It's easy to do. We all want that one job and we don't want that one job. And I would remind you, anytime you think that, to go back and read John 13. To go back and think about what Jesus did that night before he went to the cross. And then go back and read this in Philippians chapter 2. This passage that to me just always blows me away, where it says, you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. That though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges and he took the humble position of a slave, born as a human being. Jesus not only taught us servitude, but he showed us humility. He showed us humility. In fact, I'm going to say it this way. The only way you can't find satisfaction with Jesus in serving is because your pride has become bigger than your ability to follow. Your pride has become bigger than your ability to follow. And folks, again, this is very easy, and I am not trying to point fingers and stomp on toes with this. Because again, go back to what we said at the beginning. It is very easy for us to be selfish because to some degree we're all selfish. And serving pushes that away. Your desire for personal gratification cannot be bigger and greater than your ability to submit to your Lord. It simply can't. Jesus told us this in Matthew 6, the Sermon on the Mount. He tells us to be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Serving should not be a show. Serving should be a desire to pour yourself out for your God and for his people. In other words, we could say it like this: to lead like Jesus, you have to be able to serve like Jesus. Folks, the world is hungry for humble servants. It's hungry for humble servants. Serving, specifically in the church, it provides many things. Serving provides a humility. It provides community. It provides a willingness to submit to God. It gives you those things when you serve. But serving also adds fulfillment. It adds fulfillment because you are blessing somebody else the way Jesus has blessed you. And did you realize that when you serve at church, you become a bigger part of the ministry here? When you serve here, many of you know this already. For some of you, this is new. But when you serve here, you become a larger part of the ministry here. When you serve here, you become an active agent in the work of God's kingdom. That's kind of cool to think about. Some of you are like, well, I'm not sure about this. You know what? If you're in a home group, you can serve as a group. In fact, we would encourage you to, as a group, to serve together here in the church and in the community. You can find opportunities as a group. Maybe as a whole home group, you do communion some Sunday. You serve as communion. Maybe as a group, you serve in the Lord's Storehouse one Wednesday night. I know some of our groups do this already. Maybe as a group, you serve our students one week. As a group, you can do this. Maybe you don't belong to a home group yet. Man, serving is almost like a new community to be a part of. Our music team is almost like another little small group here. Okay? Our youth volunteers, our student volunteers, it's almost like another home group. People who invest in each other's lives, build each other up. Here's a takeaway for you, kind of a two-part. Sometime this week, if you've not done one before, take a spiritual gifts assessment. Maybe you know what yours are, but take one. And then find out how you can serve here at the church. Serving is burdensome, yes, but it's not a bad burden. It's not a heavy burden, it's a good burden. It's sacrifice, it's a good sacrifice. I've never served and walked away going, man, I regret that. Even if I come home exhausted and tired and frustrated, I can still step back and go, that was good. That was good. You have this fulfillment because you have tried to bless others the way that Jesus has blessed you. Never forget, you can never ever outserve God. You can never outserve your Lord. But we can try to serve like him. Let's pray. God, we are so thankful for the awesome challenge to serve. We're so thankful, Lord, that you give us these opportunities that may be hard and they may be trying and they may be out of our comfort zone. But God, you also wire us in a certain way to serve. God, to serve your church and to serve your kingdom in ways that we're gifted for, in ways that we have desires for. So God, my prayer today is as we come to this spot, as we come to this step, Lord, if somebody is curious about serving, or they've thought in the past, you know what, I don't think I want to do this. I don't care that much about doing this. Lord, you would soften their hearts. You would speak to them. You would show them opportunities. God, that you would give people the confidence to step forward. God, you would help them to find where there's a need and an opening here, Lord, that we could get them plugged in. God, I'm thankful that you remind me every day, Lord, that I need to humble myself. God, that you remind us as a group, we need to humble ourselves. Because though we may have been given gifts in some area, Lord, we are still your servants. God, I'm so thankful for the examples that Jesus gave us. And God, I pray, I know for myself and for this group too, that you would increase our desire to become more like him. God, we're thankful for Jesus. We pray today in his name. Amen.